We've now got our paper review. Believe it or not, it is Christmas Day, but we are going to take a look at tomorrow's Boxing Day front pages. Joining me this evening, broadcaster David Prever and Middle East commentator Nabila Ramdani. Very good evening to both of you. Merry Christmas. Thank you very much for joining us here on Sky News on Christmas Day. And probably because it is Christmas Day, a lot of tomorrow's papers are in already because there isn't an awful lot of news going on, but still a lot of different stories on the front pages. Let's start with the Eye, because this focuses on church leaders and their different Christmas messages today. The Archbishop of Westminster, Vincent Nichols, and he's been talking about Israel and rebuking Israel over the Palestinians. The Archbishop of York, Dr. John Santamu, attacking what he called extortionate money lending, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, comparing city speculators to rioters. And lastly, but of course not least, Pope Benedict XVI talking about conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. Of course, today is very much a day for the leaders to get their message across. They almost have a captive audience, don't they? But very political messages today, Nabila.
Absolutely, but I don't think that there's anything particularly new in all this. I think religious leaders have always been politicized and have always put across political messages. So I don't think there's something particularly new, as I said, in all this. But I think it's very much the role, in my opinion, of religious leaders to have a say in socio-economic and indeed political problems. Obviously, their first and foremost priority is to saving people's souls. That's what they're here for, and look after them in eternity. But that doesn't preclude them from having a say on worldly affairs as well, on day-to-day matters. I think that's hugely important.
I disagree. I find this quite tiresome, and I accept that they have views and they're entitled to have views, and there's no harm in them expressing their views. But at a time when we learned only this week that fewer people than ever before are going to church on a regular basis, turning their backs on Christianity, I think it's the job of our religious leaders to address personal challenges that people face in their lives rather than these big macro political issues, which, to be honest, they run the risk of polarizing people rather than bringing people back towards the church. And there is a let's leave politics to the politicians aspect to all of this. And I think a lot of people will listen to what some of these leaders. I haven't heard all of the speeches. I only heard the clip you're playing of the Archbishop of Canterbury, where he seemed to be comparing, maybe it was taken out of context, but comparing the moralities of bankers with the moralities of rioters. And I think they're on very dangerous territory, where the reaction of a lot of people who may declare themselves Christians will say, well, I disagree with you.
Let me read you that quote. Yeah. He says that whether it's an urban rioter mindlessly burning down a small shop that serves his community, or a speculator turning his back on the question of who bears the ultimate cost for his acquisitive adventures in the virtual reality of today's financial world, the picture is of atoms spinning apart in the dark. So not quite a direct comparison there.
No, but what is he talking about? What does he mean?
He's essentially highlighting the breakdown of social responsibility in Britain, and he spoke of bonds being broken in society and trust being abused, and I think it came across as a bit of a muddled speech, because he was shying away from saying who exactly was responsible from the breakdown of all these of this social responsibility and the social problems. But what it certainly said is that the Church of England must have a say in socio-economic problems faced by British people. In my opinion, the speech was a bit confusing, because at the same time the Church is saying one thing, it's saying that many people, especially as the St. Paul's protests showed, many people in the Church of England think that it's very ugly that to have camps outside St. Paul's and people shouldn't be there, and some people within the Church of England didn't want them there. But at the same time there was also this message that the Church should after all look after all these poor people.
Also, David, don't these leaders have to be relevant? Don't they have to talk about what is going on in the world? Otherwise, what should they be talking about? Just sermons? I think they should be talking about the
challenges that individual people face in their everyday life, and religion when preachers are at their very best, they manage to communicate and touch those universal human emotions, whether it's people's personal financial pressures with their family, health matters, whatever it might be. That's the stuff that really brings people to the church, I think, not what the Archbishop of Canterbury or Dr. John Santamu might think about what's going on in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, your day-to-day life is bound to be affected by bigger problems. We have this story today about the Nigerian bombings, where
That's
people
also on the front of the eye there, just in the top right-hand corner. Of course, the militant Islamists killed dozens in the Nigerian church attacks. We've seen dozens killed there.
And it just tells you how churches are indeed involved in day-to-day life, to the point that they're being the victims of extremist violence. So that's, a bigger political issue, Islamic extremism. And it's affecting, people involved in going to church or any other religious place. In particular instance, Christians have been targeted on Christmas Day, which is a sinister, a really sinister act. And clearly, these people, evil people, are seeking maximum publicity on Christmas Day.
Yeah, let's talk a bit more about those attacks. It's believed they were done by Boko Haram organisation in Nigeria, who are basically saying that their name means Western education is forbidden, and they often target security forces and state institutions. And today we've seen people who are trying to celebrate Christmas being targeted there.
Well, it's just terrific. I mean, the pictures you've been showing all day, for a church to be attacked at any time, but especially on Christmas Day, raises so many fundamental questions about belief, personal belief, and also about what's going on there politically, which is your you know a lot more about Al Qaeda in the Middle East and what's going on there. But Nigeria, I didn't realise Nigeria was such a hotbed for fundamentalist activities. It seems now to be.
It has come to the fore in 2009, where there were sectarian violence in Nigeria. But every year, I mean, in 2011 alone, for example, they have killed up to 450 people this year alone. Last year, on Christmas Eve, the Boko Haram organization, which is behind the church bombings this year, have also targeted churches, killing up to 80 people last year on Christmas Eve. So they are, as you said, essentially anti-Western, and in my opinion they operate more like a sect than a terrorist group, because they're so anti-Western they go as far as saying that it's anti-Islamic to wear shirts and trousers, for example.
Of course, they carried out an attack on the UN in Nigeria back in August. Do you think, while we've seen this year the year of the Arab Spring, next year we could see a lot more from this part of the world, Nigeria, Sudan, Yemen?
But what this kind of action shows is that even with the death of Osama bin Laden, who epitomized Islamic extremism didn't die with him. And you're bound to see marginal organizations like Boko Haram operating in the same manner.
Do you think that Africa is now the focus of that extremism?
Very much so. Boko Haram, for example, has very close links with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, but also terrorist groups in Somalia, for example.
Okay, let's have a look at the mirror now, moving away from religious issues and onto the Queen, who put a brave face on it, but she does look a bit sad in this particular picture, alone, as it says, for the first time in 55 years, with Prince Philip now spending his third night in hospital today in Cambridgeshire tonight. But she and the family still determined to kind of put on a show at Sandringham, weren't they?
Yes, I wonder where they got that. Haven't they been married for 64 years? I'm sure. We do the maths, but I'm sure they've been married longer than that. Didn't they get married in 1947, I think?
Well, that Prince Philip by his side since 1956.
Yeah, I'm being a pedant, but I think
there must have been a reason. There must be a reason why they were apart for some Christmases.
For some of
maybe
those
because
years.
he was serving in the military.
Yeah, possibly. I think that people feel very sad for Her Majesty the Queen this Christmas, because you can put all the trappings to one side, the fact that she's surrounded by however many servants and family and luxuries that most people can only dream of. At the end of the day, she's an old lady whose husband's in hospital at Christmas, and that connects on such a basic level with so many of her subjects around the country. I think the idea that there she is on her own, away from the man who she spent all of her life with, which is terribly sad.
And family was, of course, the theme of the Queen's speech. So her words had particular poignancy this year because of the state of health of Prince Philip. And it's terrible to have a member of your family or anybody in hospital at Christmas. And he was very much, there was a real gaping hole in the royal lineup this year.
And of course, a huge year for the royal family, even bigger one perhaps to come. But let's just reflect on the success that they've had with these 2 royal weddings, as the Queen spoke about 2 of her grandchildren getting married this year. And you really saw that effect at Sandringham, didn't you, today, with, I think, our correspondent saying more people than ever turning up, spending hours in line, waiting for a word, a shot of the royals there, particularly, of course, probably one of the most favourites now of the royals, Catherine. There, the Duchess of Cambridge, of course.
Well, Kate is very much the glamorous new member of the royal family.
She's on a couple of tomorrow's front pages. Let's have a look.
Oh, she looked
fantastic. There on the Guardian,
fantastic.
And she's also Daily Star. Absolutely beautiful. She can't put a sartorial foot wrong, can she?
No, and there were stories in the week that she had to have 5 outfits for today. Apparently, one for breakfast and then lunch and cocktails and what have you.
And that's a lovely Christmas hat designed by Jane Corbett, and it's very, very elegant aubergine coat.
Yeah.
It's interesting, there was a period 3, 4, 5 years ago, there was a real sense of republicanism spreading throughout the country, and I think, for a while I was part of that. I don't know where that came from, but somehow my attitudes have, I'm a staunch royalist now, and it's crept up on me, I don't know where from. Maybe it's partly to do with the new youngsters, but also the fact that I think that Her Majesty the Queen is such an endearing old lady. What's not to like about her?
It has to be noted also that she fitted in particularly well. You know, William is of course used to these annual traditional events, but it was her first one, and she didn't make a faux pas at all.
She seems to be growing in confidence, doesn't she?
Completely.
She doesn't really seem to be putting a foot wrong, as I say, sartorially or otherwise. She really, the crowds love her.
Particularly relaxed as well.
But it's also been noted how William is always by her side, really the arm around her and the presence that kind of makes sure that she feels secure, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a deeply worrying time for Her Majesty. This is a serious the doctors and surgeons made it sound as though it was run-of-the-mill. On by all accounts, having a stent put in is a pretty basic operation these days. But nevertheless, he's a 90-year-old man with a blocked artery, and she must be deeply worried, deeply concerned about it.
Okay, David and Nabila will be back after this short break. We'll just give you a quick shot of The Independent, because we'll talk about that after this short break, so do stay with us.
In many other countries in the world.
But as you say, with an increasing number of people leaving it later and later, how can the health service sustain that?
It probably can't. But if it was to offer the guidance, when I last looked, the HFEA and NICE guidance was that couples should be entitled to at least 2 rounds of treatment. In many councils, that doesn't happen at all. In many boroughs, you're lucky, depending on your age, if you even get 1 cycle of treatment.
Is it fair to say also that, of course, these people know they're dealing with perhaps mainly careerists? Is that fair to say that?
Yes,
people,
you're dealing, I mean,
professionals who are quite well off and who would go to any length to have children, which will
majority of patients are 35 plus. A lot of women single, very career-minded. They have disposable income. But there's also a lot of people that don't have the money and will be mortgaging their homes and getting into huge amounts of debt.
And that's the problem, isn't it? I do know people in that situation who will go to any length and any cost, and as you say, mortgaging themselves to the hilt and putting themselves in debt because they're so desperate to have a child.
The point that Lord Winston doesn't make, or this piece doesn't make, is that the drug companies have some questions to answer as well. That a cycle of treatment may cost you £2,000, but then when you get the bill for the drugs regime that you have to follow, intensive drugs regime, you can look at another £2,000 or £3,000 on top of that very easily. It's a shock when you go to the pharmacy and they say, this is what we're going to take from you.
Okay, let's have a look at the front page picture there, the traditional dive into the freezing cold Serpentine, but it was the warmest Christmas day for decades. Nevertheless, they do look cold, these guys.
The guy in the Hawaiian shorts I like the best. He's fantastic. He's thinking, it was a good idea at the time, but what am I doing here now?
Yeah, do you think they're thinking that this evening when they see that front page?
Quite brave though, because the water will be really cold.
But at least they didn't have to break the ice for that one. Okay, well, well done to them for braving the chilly waters. Let's have a look at the Guardian front page. Duchess of Cambridge there, looking gorgeous in her aubergine outfit there. Front page story though, faith in Cameron grows as Miliband fails to impress. This is an exclusive ICM poll which shows that the public are putting economic trust behind the Prime Minister as Labour leader struggles to make his case, and there's some detailed questions that have been asked. Cameron versus Miliband, good in a crisis. 50% think that Cameron is, just 21% think Miliband is. This is a problem that the Labour leader has suffered since he took over a year ago now as head of the Labour Party, and doesn't seem as though winning the battle, does it?
Yes.
I wonder how long it's going to be before Labour backbenchers start getting a little bit uneasy in the new year and start demanding some action from their leader. I think it'll happen quicker than we expect.
Demanding action from this leader or demanding a new leader?
Maybe a bit of both. But I know they're certainly uneasy at the moment. His honeymoon period is well and truly over. He didn't perform particularly well in the last PMQs of the year when he really had an open goal and failed to hit the back of the net at all. But it'll be interesting to see where this one goes in the new year, I think.
Nabila, what do you think? Do you think it might be calls for his brother to make a reappearance? Questions about whether they got the right Miliband, or questions about whether maybe Ed Balls could be in for the top job?
I think it's a question on whether they have the right leader, to be honest. Perhaps not the brother, but just somebody who's able to impress more Labour voters. And it has to be said that Cameron has shown a very good leadership this year, not least in Libya. I mean, it was a controversial war, in my opinion, but he still, led the way into the conflict. And of course, over the Euro crisis, where he stood by British interests, he showed real leadership. He knew exactly what he wanted out of the Euro summit, and it turns out that now European countries are begging Britain to be more involved in the European project. So he showed some character, some strength.
David, although the Westminster Village and perhaps journalists very much focus on PMQs as the weekly point where you compare the leaders, time and again David Cameron does seem to be the one who comes out on top. Do you think that plays a part in it, or actually as far as the wider public are concerned, they're not focused on that kind of thing?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I think PMQs is important not only for the Westminster Village because it sets the agenda certainly for the next 24 or 48 hours. But I think there is let's be perfectly honest, Ed Miliband, nice chap that he might be, he's not cutting the mustard in terms of charisma and presence. Whatever you may say about the Bullingdon, I was on LBC doing a programme last night and had lots of emails about the Bullingdon boy this, and there's still that class thing about David Cameron, but he still has the confidence and charisma and is growing into the office, I think, in a way that, of course, the leader of the opposition never can. And for him to try and find some sort of presence, I think is very difficult. I don't know how he does that, but that's what I think he needs to work on.
He's very witty as well, David Cameron, and quite cheeky, and I think people like that in a leader.
It's quicker to put down, isn't he?
Yes. Yeah.
And that wins points at PMQs. Okay, let's take a look at the Daily Telegraph, which is just in. Another picture, not surprisingly, of the Duchess of Cambridge. And their lead story there, cheating parents, the true scale of school fraud. Let's read a little bit more into this. It says that thousands of parents are suspected of committing fraud in an attempt to get their children into the most sought-after state schools. Council data suggests there have been 420 cases in which mothers and fathers entered false information on school application forms to get placed in the best primary and secondary schools this year. Almost 2,000 cases have been detected in the past 5 years. We all know what a battle it is to get your kids into the top schools, and you can understand the pressure that parents feel, but I'm not quite sure what happens if you get found out when your child's already in a school. If you have lied, I don't know, do they get kicked out?
It seems a bad precedent to set, lying about you. Presumably this is just lying about your address on an application form. Presumably that's all it is. When we're outside the catchment area for primary school, we're looking out for my boy, and the thought that you would lie about where you live, presumably he then has to perpetuate that lie when he's asked in class, where do you live? What you tell your child, if you're asked where we live,
I don't understand how you lie, because the council knows where you're paying council tax. So surely they have your address, and if you are giving them a wrong address, surely they can look it up. Anyway, I guess it's what shows more pressure,
and also how important education is to sort out, people's lives.
I suspect if we read more about that story, there's probably not much to it, and it's one of those quiet Christmas Day on the Telegraph news desk. Let's go with this because it gives us something to write about, other than religion.
Talking of religion, let's have a quick look at the Times front page, because they are leading on the Archbishop who's been under fire. We were talking about whether it was right or wrong for him to be talking in the terms that he did, but he's been criticised for his political riot sermon. Another story that's on the front of the Star, this is George Michael, who we heard from on Friday, talking about this near-death experience, this terrible experience he's had trying to fight pneumonia, and fears now that he will never sing again. He said obviously he wants to complete the tour that he hasn't been able to finish. He wants to very much sing at the hospital where those doctors and nurses battled to save his life. And it is a story that I guess we'll hear more and more about over the coming weeks when he perhaps gets better and talks a bit more about what he's been through. But I guess for all his fans out there, it'd be a really sad day if they don't
I think
get
this
to
is
hear him.
a nonsense story.
I don't know.
Oh,
I don't know.
why?
He's gone through a terrible year, and
I bet this is based on absolutely no facts or no conversation with George Michael's office. Just probably a boozy afternoon again in the Daily Star offices where they've said, I wonder if George Michael will ever sing again. There's our front page.
it has come up before, though, that health concern. Well, if true, you know, it will be terribly sad, and, you know, especially at this time of year when you think about his hit Last Christmas, which is an anthem at this time of year.
I think George will sing again. I've met him
Well,
a
I
few
hope
times
so,
and
because
he's
he's
a lovely
hugely
guy.
popular.
He'll be out
He's
there
making
again.
people happy all over the world.
Yeah,
He
he'll be
certainly
singing.
didn't give that impression, did he? Anyway, they say that is their exclusive. They've had that information from medics, so we will wait
There
to
we
see. Let's just remind our viewers of, because we've got practically all the front pages in, which for this time of night is quite incredible, but it shows it's Christmas Day. They had perhaps
Journalists gone home early.
papers had their stories already lined up. So let's just remind our viewers what is on those front pages. We'll start with the Daily Express and putting on a brave face for Philip there while the Prince Philip remains in hospital tonight again. The Guardian's front page, that poll we were just talking about, showing that Cameron is still retaining a significant lead over David Miliband, who it says is failing to impress. The independent IVF clinics are ripping off desperate couples. The Daily Mail, Prince Philip's plea, just let me go home. And you can imagine, can't you?
Yes.
And the Daily Mirror, flown for the first time. David, Nabila, thank you very much for taking us
Thank you.
through the Boxing Day papers. Merry Christmas
And
to
to
you
you
both.
too.